was the Queen for a very long time. And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity. But I think for my brother, this is something he's been waiting for. And he's probably spent more time thinking about it. For the rest of us, it's more a question of, okay, we have to shift the way we support. And that's what we need to do.
For years, there was a question the British press asked constantly but never quite dared to answer honestly. Why didn't Prince Philip live with the Queen? Not in the way you're imagining. Not divorce, not scandal, not some hidden falling out kept behind palace walls. Something stranger. Something that, once you understand it, will change the way you think about 70 years of marriage. Because for the final years of his life, the Duke of Edinburgh didn't sleep at Buckingham Palace beside his wife. He lived in a farmhouse, miles away, on the edge of a windswept Norfolk estate. And the tabloids, naturally, went wild with it. Royal rift. Marriage on the rocks. 70 years and now this. But here's what almost nobody outside a very small circle of royal historians and biographers actually understood at the time. This wasn't the ending of a marriage falling apart. It was, in a strange and quietly moving way, the marriage working exactly as it was designed to. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to see Philip and Elizabeth 73 years together completely differently. And if stories like this, the ones the tabloids get wrong and history gets right, are the kind of thing you want more of, do me a favor and hit subscribe before we go further.
He would only be capable of making any contribution if he was sovereign is really not true. There have been so many cases where the heir has in fact had a very particular ability to do things which he wouldn't have otherwise. But I mean, who knows? These things, it's all in the future, anything may happen.
There are those who say that the monarchy is an anachronism, that its day is over, that it serves no purpose other than a kind of tradition.
Genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories the gossip columns never bothered to understand. Think about the sheer scale of what we're talking about. This isn't some minor celebrity couple whose living situation barely registers outside a gossip column. This is the longest reigning monarch in British history and the longest serving royal consort the monarchy has ever had. 70 years of marriage. Two world-famous faces, photographed together at nearly every state occasion for 7 decades, standing side by side through coronations, jubilees, wars, scandals involving nearly every other member of their family, and the slow, grinding pressure of simply being watched, constantly, by an entire nation and much of the world beyond it. And through all of that, this one detail, where they actually slept at night, became one of the most persistently misunderstood facts in the entire history of the British monarchy. Every few years, some new headline would resurface it. A royal biographer would mention it in passing during an interview, and suddenly it would explode across front pages as though it had just been discovered for the first time. Royal marriage in crisis. Philip and the Queen living apart. And every time, the palace would offer nothing. No confirmation, no denial, just silence, which of course only fed the speculation further. Silence, in the world of tabloid journalism, is practically an invitation to invent your own explanation. And invent they did. Now, let's go back to where this really began.
But for me, in the months since the death of my beloved Philip, I have drawn great comfort from the warmth and affection of the many tributes to his life and work, from around the country, the Commonwealth, and the world.
It wasn't 2017. It wasn't the farmhouse. It wasn't even close. To understand why Philip eventually chose a 5-bedroom cottage on the Sandringham estate over the palace his wife occupied, you have to go back to 1947, to a wedding, and to a tradition that almost nobody outside the British aristocracy has ever heard of. When Princess Elizabeth married Philip Mountbatten in November of that year, the world watched a fairy tale unfold. Westminster Abbey. A young naval officer marrying the future Queen of England. But behind the ceremony and the photographs, something far less romantic sounding, and yet far more telling, was quietly arranged. When the newlyweds moved into Clarence House in 1949, they did not share a bedroom. Not because anything was wrong. Not because of any rift or coldness between them. Because in the world they came from, that simply wasn't how marriage worked. This is the part that surprises most people. In the upper echelons of British aristocracy, in the world Elizabeth and Philip were both raised in, separate bedrooms weren't a red flag. They were the norm. It was so ordinary that hardly anyone in their circle would have thought to comment on it at all. Lady Pamela Hicks, Philip's own cousin, who later became one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting and who knew this couple as intimately as almost anyone alive, wrote about this tradition with real frankness in her own memoirs. She described it plainly. The reasoning was practical, not emotional. You don't want to be disturbed in the night. You don't want your rest interrupted by someone else's movements, someone else's snoring, someone else's restless hours. Quality sleep mattered. Personal space mattered. But, and this is the detail that changes everything, when you wanted to be close, when you felt tender toward each other, the choice was always there. You simply walked through the connecting door.
He would only be capable of making any contribution if he was sovereign is really not true. There have been so many cases where the heir has in fact had a very particular ability to do things which he wouldn't have otherwise. But I mean, who knows? These things, it's all in the future. Anything may happen.
Read that again, because it matters. The choice itself becomes the intimacy. Nobody was forcing togetherness. Nobody was forcing distance either. Every night, in a small quiet way, Philip and Elizabeth chose each other, or didn't, entirely on their own terms. Their rooms at Clarence House weren't at opposite ends of some enormous building. They were adjacent, connected by a door. Always within reach of each other, always with the option, never with the obligation. And this wasn't some private eccentricity unique to Philip and Elizabeth. This was, by every historical account, standard practice among the British upper class for generations before either of them was born. Country houses across England were built with this exact arrangement in mind, his rooms and her rooms, connected by a shared dressing area or a single door, entirely by design, not by accident. Architects of great English estates in the 18th and 19th centuries planned for it explicitly. It reflected an entire worldview about marriage that modern audiences often struggle to understand, one where practicality, privacy, and mutual respect for another person's rest and routine were considered just as important as romantic closeness, if not more so. In that world, sharing a bed every single night wasn't seen as some obvious proof of devotion.
Because my mother didn't change very much, you kind of knew what the rhythm of the year was. So things like that will change.
It was almost seen as slightly impractical, even a little naive, evidence that a couple hadn't yet worked out how to structure a life together that could actually last decades without friction. So when Elizabeth and Philip moved into Clarence House as newlyweds in 1949, nobody in their circle blinked. This is precisely the detail the tabloids, writing decades later for a mass audience raised on an entirely different set of assumptions about marriage, completely failed to contextualize. They took an arrangement that was, in its original setting, almost aggressively normal, and presented it to modern readers as though it were inherently suspicious. As though two people who valued their own space must, by definition, be quietly falling out of love. But that reading only works if you strip the arrangement of its actual context. It's worth remembering that Elizabeth and Philip were both raised, in very different ways, within this same aristocratic framework. Elizabeth grew up in a household where her own parents, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, maintained similarly structured living arrangements, and Philip, despite the far more turbulent and itinerant nature of his own childhood, spent considerable time as a young man in precisely the kind of English country houses where this tradition was simply assumed. Neither of them was inventing something unusual when they arrived at Clarence House together. They were simply continuing a pattern both of them had grown up inside of, one neither of them would have thought to question, because in their world, it wasn't a question at all. It was just how a household of their standing was built. And this wasn't a one-time arrangement they abandoned once they'd settled into married life. This followed them everywhere. Buckingham Palace, once Elizabeth became queen in 1952. Windsor Castle. Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands. Sandringham in Norfolk. Every single residence the two of them ever lived in, for the entirety of their marriage, contained the exact same architecture of connected but separate rooms. For 73 years, from the day they married until the day Philip died, this was simply how they lived. So when news broke in 2017 that Philip was moving into a farmhouse on the Sandringham estate, separate not just in bedroom but in entire residence, the tabloids treated it as some seismic shift, some final unraveling of a marriage that had quietly been failing all along. But it wasn't new. It wasn't radical. It was the same principle they'd lived by since 1949, simply expanded. A larger version of a boundary they'd honored their entire married life. And there's a person who watched this dynamic her entire childhood, who grew up in those palaces with the connecting doors and the separate rooms and the quiet, mutual respect that came with them. Princess Anne. And what she has said about her parents' marriage over the years, in interviews, in documentaries, in the small unguarded moments where her famous bluntness slips through, paints a picture entirely different from the one the papers sold you. We'll get to exactly what she said. But first, you need to understand the place at the center of this story. Because it's not just a cottage. It's practically a character in its own right. Wood Farm sits on the edge of the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, roughly 2 miles from the main house, close enough to reach easily, far enough to feel like an entirely different world. It's been described by those who've actually visited as a comfortable, open-beamed cottage, 5 bedrooms, unpretentious by any measure, let alone royal ones. No grand staircases. No portrait galleries stretching down endless corridors. No liveried footman stationed at every door. Just timber beams, low ceilings, and a view out toward the sea. By royal standards, it is almost aggressively ordinary. And that, it turns out, was exactly the point. When Philip retired from public life in 2017 at the age of 96, having completed more than 22,000 solo royal engagements over 65 years of service, a number so large it's genuinely difficult to comprehend, he didn't retire the way you might expect a man of his position to retire. He didn't simply move into a quieter wing of Windsor Castle and let the palace staff continue looking after him the way they always had. He moved into Wood Farm and made it entirely, unmistakably his own. He oversaw the installation of a new kitchen. He filled the walls with his own watercolor paintings, a hobby he'd loved since he was young but had rarely found the time to properly pursue during the decades he spent standing 3 steps behind his wife at official engagements around the world. He redesigned the bedrooms. He rearranged the rooms to fit exactly how he wanted to live, not how protocol dictated a royal residence should be arranged. He read voraciously. He reportedly kept a truffle farm on the grounds, something almost comically far removed from the image most people carry of the stiff, formal Duke of Edinburgh. He invited friends to stay whenever he liked, something the rigid formality of palace life had made genuinely difficult for most of his adult life. He read voraciously. He reportedly kept a truffle farm on the grounds, something almost comically far removed from the image most people carry of the stiff, formal Duke of Edinburgh. He invited friends to stay whenever he liked, something the rigid formality of palace life had made genuinely difficult for most of his adult life. Consider what that transformation actually represented for a man in his late 90s. For 65 years, Philip's entire existence had been curated by other people. Palace staff chose the flowers. Protocol officers determined the seating charts. Equerries planned his schedule down to the minute, sometimes years in advance. Even his own home, wherever he happened to be living at any given moment, was decorated according to considerations of history, ceremony, and state function rather than his own personal taste. He had spent decades of his life surrounded by portraits of other people's ancestors, sitting on furniture selected for its historical significance rather than its comfort, walking through rooms designed to project the authority of an institution rather than to reflect the person actually living in them. At Wood Farm, for the first time in longer than most of us have been alive, none of that applied. The paintings on the walls were his. The kitchen layout was his. The books on the shelves were the ones he actually wanted to read, not the ones tradition dictated should occupy a royal library. It's difficult to overstate how rare that kind of ordinary autonomy actually was for a man in his position, and how much it must have meant to finally have it, even this late in life. And here's a detail that tells you more than almost anything else in this story. The staff at Wood Farm didn't wear uniforms. If you know anything about how the monarchy actually functions, you know that detail is almost radical. The entire machinery of royal life runs on visible hierarchy, on uniforms and titles, and everyone knowing precisely their place. At Buckingham Palace, every single staff member has a defined role, a defined title, a defined uniform. At Wood Farm, none of that existed. Just people, living simply, without ceremony. And when Elizabeth visited, which she did far more regularly than most people ever realized, because the press mostly missed it or chose not to report it, she didn't arrive to be waited on. She cooked. She washed the dishes. Picture that for a moment. The Queen of England, the woman whose face appeared on currency circulated across half the planet, standing at a kitchen sink in a modest Norfolk cottage, sleeves rolled up, washing plates after an ordinary dinner with her husband. That image should stop you in your tracks, because it tells you almost everything you need to know about what Wood Farm actually was. It wasn't an escape from their marriage. It was maybe the truest, least performed expression of it that existed anywhere. Behind every palace wall, behind every state banquet and formal portrait, this was the version of the two of them that almost nobody ever saw. Two elderly people, cooking dinner, doing dishes, existing without an audience for the first time in most of their adult lives. Now here's where the story gets a little heavier and a little stranger, because Wood Farm wasn't just some blank, unused cottage that happened to be available when Philip decided he wanted somewhere quiet. It carries its own history, threaded through decades of royal life, some of it joyful, some of it genuinely sorrowful. The royal family started using Wood Farm back in 1967, when Philip himself selected it as a retreat for family and guests, somewhere free from the expense and formality of the main house at Sandringham. Over the following decades, it quietly became one of the rare places connected to the royal family that felt genuinely private. Prince Charles hosted shooting parties there during his university years and kept using it as a country retreat well into adulthood. Princess Diana stayed there before her engagement to Charles was even announced, back when the whole story still felt like the beginning of a fairy tale rather than what it eventually became. Kate Middleton visited the cottage early in her relationship with William, a visit that royal watchers at the time understood as a real sign of how seriously the family was taking that relationship. Now here's where the story gets a little heavier and a little stranger, because Wood Farm wasn't just some blank, unused cottage that happened to be available when Philip decided he wanted somewhere quiet. It carries its own history, threaded through decades of royal life, some of it joyful, some of it genuinely sorrowful. The royal family started using Wood Farm back in 1967, when Philip himself selected it as a retreat for family and guests, somewhere free from the expense and formality of the main house at Sandringham. Over the following decades, it quietly became one of the rare places connected to the royal family that felt genuinely private. Prince Charles hosted shooting parties there during his university years and kept using it as a country retreat well into adulthood. Princess Diana stayed there before her engagement to Charles was even announced, back when the whole story still felt like the beginning of a fairy tale rather than what it eventually became. Kate Middleton visited the cottage early in her relationship with William, a visit that royal watchers at the time understood as a real sign of how seriously the family was taking that relationship. It's worth pausing on that pattern for a moment, because it tells you something important about how the family itself regarded the place, long before Philip ever moved there permanently. Wood Farm wasn't where you took a new partner to impress them with grandeur. There was no grandeur to speak of. It was where you took someone when you wanted them to see the family stripped of ceremony, when you wanted to know how they'd handle simplicity rather than spectacle. Diana's early visits there, and later Kate's, functioned almost like a quiet test, though nobody would have called it that at the time. Could this person sit in a modest farmhouse kitchen, away from cameras and protocol, and still feel like they belonged? For a family whose entire public existence was built on ceremony, that private, unglamorous cottage became, paradoxically, one of the most meaningful places they had to offer. So by the time Philip chose it for his retirement, Wood Farm already carried the weight of being where the family's most private, most unguarded moments had quietly taken place for half a century. But there's a darker chapter buried in that same history, one that even people who consider themselves serious royal watchers often don't know. Back in 1917, King George V and Queen Mary made a devastating decision involving their youngest son, Prince John. The boy had been suffering from increasingly severe epileptic seizures, a condition that was, at the time, treated with a mixture of medical ignorance and social shame that's almost unimaginable today. As his seizures worsened and public appearances became impossible to manage, the family made the choice, one history has judged with real harshness in the years since, to quietly send the young prince to live at Wood Farm, away from the rest of the family, away from public view entirely. It's important to understand the era this decision came from. In early 20th century Britain, epilepsy carried a stigma so severe that even educated, otherwise compassionate families often treated it as something to be hidden rather than managed openly. Prince John was reportedly a gentle, warm child by most surviving accounts, close to his nanny and fond of simple pleasures, but his condition placed him entirely outside the rigid expectations of what a royal child was supposed to be able to do and be seen doing. Rather than adapt those expectations, the family simply removed him from the picture. He lived at Wood Farm under the care of his devoted nanny, largely separated from his parents and siblings, in a decision that today reads as one of the more quietly tragic footnotes in the entire history of the House of Windsor. Prince John lived there for 2 years. He died at Wood Farm in 1919, at just 13 years old. It's a chapter of royal history that sits uncomfortably next to everything warmer that came later, and it's rarely discussed publicly at all. And yet, somehow, the cottage absorbed even that grief and went on, decade after decade, to become a place of retreat and renewal rather than a place permanently defined by sorrow. When Philip chose it for his retirement, in some very real sense he was choosing a place soaked in the full range of what a family actually is. Not the sanitized, ceremonial version presented to the public, but the real one, joy and grief both, quietly folded into the same rooms. Now, we come to what actually happened at Wood Farm during Philip's retirement, and to what people close to the family, and included, have said about what this arrangement really meant. Because Princess Anne, famous across Britain for her directness, for her almost complete refusal to perform emotion for cameras the way other royals occasionally do, has spoken over the years about her parents' relationship in ways that push back hard against the tabloid version of events. She's been unambiguous that the public narrative, distant marriage, quiet estrangement, two people simply going through the motions after 7 decades, badly misunderstood what was actually happening. In her view, and in the view of people who actually knew her parents well, the arrangement between Buckingham Palace and Wood Farm was never about emotional distance. It was about something closer to its opposite. Deep, deliberate, mutual respect. Here's the distinction that the tabloids never seemed capable of grasping. Elizabeth's role wasn't a job in any sense most of us would recognize. It wasn't something with weekends, or holidays, or the option of eventual retirement. It was constitutional, in the most literal meaning of that word. The machinery of the British state required her physical presence, week after week, decade after decade. Weekly audiences with the Prime Minister. State banquets. Investitures. The reception of foreign dignitaries. An unbroken, unglamorous rhythm of duty that she had committed herself to at 21 years old and never once, not for a single day across 7 decades, set aside. Here's the distinction that the tabloids never seemed capable of grasping. Elizabeth's role wasn't a job in any sense most of us would recognize. It wasn't something with weekends, or holidays, or the option of eventual retirement. It was constitutional, in the most literal meaning of that word. The machinery of the British state required her physical presence, week after week, decade after decade. Weekly audiences with the Prime Minister. State banquets. Investitures. The reception of foreign dignitaries. An unbroken, unglamorous rhythm of duty that she had committed herself to at 21 years old and never once, not for a single day across 7 decades, set aside. Think about what that actually meant in practical terms. 15 different prime ministers served during her reign, from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss, and Elizabeth met with every single one of them, weekly, in private, unrecorded audiences that required her full presence and attention regardless of her own age, her own health, or her own personal circumstances. She carried out these duties through the death of her father, through the births of 4 children, through decades of family scandal that would have driven most people into seclusion, through her own advancing age well into her 90s. There was no version of her role that came with sick days. There was no version that allowed her to simply decide, one particular week, that she needed rest instead. That obligation was the defining structural fact of her entire adult life, and anyone who actually understood it, and understood immediately why Philip's retirement had to look different from hers. He was allowed to stop. She, by the very nature of the role she'd inherited, was not. Philip, meanwhile, had given everything a person could reasonably be asked to give. He'd walked away from a career in the Royal Navy that, by every account from people who served alongside him, he was genuinely brilliant at and deeply loved. He gave up the conventional expressions of authority that men of his generation and background were raised to expect as their birthright. For 70 years, he walked 3 steps behind his wife at public engagements around the world. He smiled, shook thousands of hands, made conversation, attended ceremonies for causes he may or may not have personally cared about, because that was the role, and he performed it without visible complaint, for decades. By 2017, he had given everything there was to give. And what Anne has made clear, in the way people close to the family understood it, was that Elizabeth gave him back the one thing that could actually match that sacrifice. Not distance. Freedom. Freedom within the marriage, not freedom from it. Freedom to live quietly. To paint. To read. To exist, for the first time in decades, without the crushing weight of protocol pressing down on every single hour of every single day. Elizabeth didn't just tolerate this arrangement. By every account from people who were actually close to them, she actively supported it, encouraged it, and understood it as an expression of love every bit as real as anything performed in public. If that's true, and the evidence strongly suggests it is, then the separate residences weren't a symptom of a marriage quietly failing. They were closer to its proudest achievement. Proof that after 70 years, 2 people still understood each other's deepest needs well enough to protect them, even when protecting them looked strange from the outside. Ask yourself honestly, how many couples, after 70 years together, could say the same thing about each other? Now here's a mini cliffhanger worth sitting with for a moment, because everything I've just told you about Wood Farm as a peaceful, chosen retirement was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. Because in March of 2020, the world changed. And the arrangement that had worked so gracefully for 3 years was about to collide with something neither of them could control. Before we get into that, if you're finding this story as quietly moving as I do, this is exactly the kind of history most channels skip past because it's not scandalous enough to click on. Consider subscribing now, because what's coming next is the part of this story that, more than anything else, proves what this marriage actually was. March 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic swept across Britain with a speed that caught almost the entire country off guard. Philip was 98 years old at the time. Elderly, with a pre-existing heart condition, and a body that, despite a genuinely remarkable lifetime of vitality, was finally beginning to show its age in ways that couldn't be ignored. He sat in the absolute highest risk category for a virus that was, at that point, killing people in numbers nobody fully understood yet. And suddenly, the arrangement that had defined the previous 3 years, Philip quietly living his own life at Wood Farm while Elizabeth continued her duties elsewhere, simply wasn't tenable anymore. The risk had become too great to ignore. So Philip left Wood Farm. He moved to Windsor Castle to be with his wife. And for the first time in years, they were living together fully. Daily. Just the 2 of them, with a dramatically reduced staff, in what royal biographers would later affectionately nickname the HMS Bubble, a small, self-contained world of 2 people, sealed off from the danger raging outside the castle walls. So Philip left Wood Farm. He moved to Windsor Castle to be with his wife. And for the first time in years, they were living together fully. Daily. Just the 2 of them, with a dramatically reduced staff, in what royal biographers would later affectionately nickname the HMS Bubble, a small, self-contained world of 2 people, sealed off from the danger raging outside the castle walls. Picture what daily life inside that bubble must have actually looked like. No state visits. No investitures. No endless procession of engagements requiring careful scheduling months in advance. For the first time in either of their adult lives, the calendar had, in effect, been cleared by forces entirely outside their control. Meals together without the pressure of an audience. Long stretches of quiet in a castle that, under ordinary circumstances, would have been full of staff, visitors, and the constant low hum of official business. Windsor Castle, a building with over 1,000 rooms, suddenly reduced to something almost intimate, almost small, built around just the two of them and a skeleton staff working to keep them safe. It's an extraordinary image when you actually sit with it. A marriage that had spent 70 years navigating protocol, distance, and duty was, in its final chapter, handed something it had almost never had before. Uninterrupted time. And here's what I want you to genuinely sit with, because it's the emotional center of this entire story. This was a couple in their late 90s. Married for over 70 years. Separate bedrooms since 1949. Separate residences since 2017. By any tabloid definition you could construct, theirs was, on paper, about as distant a marriage as you could imagine. And yet, the instant real danger arrived, there was no hesitation. No negotiation. No reluctance whatsoever. Philip simply came home to Windsor, to Elizabeth. Does that sound to you like a marriage quietly falling apart? Or does it sound like the exact opposite? Because to me, it sounds like the clearest possible definition of an unbreakable one. They spent that final year together in a way they hadn't in years, unhurried, unscheduled, away from the constant machinery of public duty that had shaped nearly every hour of their adult lives. And while Philip's health was declining, while his mobility grew more limited and his hospital stays more frequent, the two of them were present with each other in a way that decades of protocol and obligation had sometimes made genuinely difficult. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, passed away on the 9th of April, 2021, at Windsor Castle. He was 99 years old. He did not die at Wood Farm, the place of his retirement, the place he'd made entirely his own. He died at Windsor, the place where, when it mattered more than it ever had before, he and Elizabeth chose to face uncertainty together. In the end, they were side by side. What happened after his death tells you, in some ways, even more about the truth of this marriage than anything that came before it. Queen Elizabeth II, arguably the most stoic, most rigidly duty-bound monarch in modern British history, a woman who had maintained her composure through wars, through constitutional crises, through personal losses that would have broken almost anyone else, was undeniably broken by this particular loss. Not publicly. Never publicly. But in the small, quiet ways that people who actually knew her could see clearly. And where did she go in the months that followed? Wood Farm. Again and again. She flew by helicopter to Sandringham and chose, repeatedly, to stay not at the grand main house, but at the cottage itself. Philip's cottage. Philip's space. The place where his watercolor paintings still hung exactly where he'd left them, where the kitchen he'd personally designed remained untouched, exactly as it had been. She stayed there, notably, around the anniversary of her father King George VI's death, on the 6th of February, a date that had always carried enormous personal weight for her, marking the precise moment in 1952 when she became queen and Philip became her consort, the moment that determined the entire shape of the life they would go on to share. She wasn't returning to Wood Farm despite the memories waiting there. She was returning because of them. Think, for a moment, about what it actually means to go back to the place where the person you loved most was happiest. To sit in rooms he personally arranged. To be surrounded by art he made with his own hands. To stand in the kitchen where you once cooked simple, unremarkable meals together, and washed the dishes side by side while the wind came in off the Norfolk Sea. That is not the behavior of someone who lived apart from their spouse because a marriage had gone cold. That is the behavior of someone who, even deep in grief, is still quietly reaching for the presence of the person they loved most in the entire world. In her final years, between Philip's death in April of 2021 and her own passing in September of 2022, Elizabeth returned to Wood Farm repeatedly. The cottage had become something close to sacred ground. Arguably the single most honest physical expression of their entire marriage. The one place where the crown, for a few days at a time, could be quietly set down and two people could simply be themselves. So what does all of this actually teach us? Not just about Philip and Elizabeth specifically, but about love in general, about what a genuinely mature, long-tested marriage can look like when it's stripped of every assumption we've been taught to bring to it. We live in a culture absolutely saturated with one very specific idea of what a successful relationship is supposed to look like. Constant togetherness. Constant closeness. The couple that does absolutely everything together, that can't imagine a single morning without the other person within arm's reach. We've romanticized inseparability so completely that any deviation from it, separate bedrooms, separate holidays, real time spent genuinely apart, gets treated almost automatically as a warning sign. A red flag. Evidence that something has quietly gone wrong beneath the surface. We live in a culture absolutely saturated with one very specific idea of what a successful relationship is supposed to look like. Constant togetherness. Constant closeness. The couple that does absolutely everything together, that can't imagine a single morning without the other person within arm's reach. We've romanticized inseparability so completely that any deviation from it, separate bedrooms, separate holidays, real time spent genuinely apart, gets treated almost automatically as a warning sign. A red flag. Evidence that something has quietly gone wrong beneath the surface. Scroll through any relationship advice column today and you'll find the same message repeated endlessly. Couples who thrive are couples who share everything. Shared calendars. Shared friend groups. Shared hobbies. Shared beds, every single night, without exception. And there is real value in a lot of that advice, for a lot of people. But it's worth asking where that specific expectation actually came from, and whether it's really as universal, or as necessary, as we've been taught to assume. Because for most of human history, and across most cultures, marriage looked considerably less like constant merger and considerably more like two individual lives running in careful parallel, occasionally intersecting, deliberately maintained as distinct even while deeply, permanently bound together. Philip and Elizabeth's marriage is simply one of the most visible, most thoroughly documented examples of that older model still operating well into the 21st century, long after most of the culture around them had moved on to a different one entirely. Philip and Elizabeth challenge nearly every part of that assumption, and they do it with 73 years of lived evidence behind them. From their very first home together at Clarence House, they maintained separate bedrooms, not because the marriage was cold, but because they genuinely understood something that a lot of modern relationship thinking is only now starting to catch up with. That quality rest, personal space, and real individual privacy aren't threats to intimacy. They're closer to its actual foundation. You cannot give yourself fully to another person if you are perpetually depleted, perpetually without a moment of solitude, perpetually denied the room to simply be yourself, away from anyone's expectations, even the expectations of someone you love. In Philip's retirement, that same principle simply extended further, into a fuller, larger version of the same boundary. He moved to a cottage he genuinely loved. She continued the work she'd committed her entire life to at 21 years old. They visited each other regularly, far more often than the press ever accurately reported. They talked. They shared the moments that actually mattered between them. And when the world turned genuinely dark and dangerous in 2020, they came together without a single second of hesitation, spending the final year of Philip's life quietly, fully, side by side. The real story here isn't really about logistics, about who slept where or which residence someone happened to be staying in on a given week. It's a story about what mature love can actually look like at its most seasoned, its most honest. Love that doesn't demand constant proximity as proof of its own existence. Love that says, in effect, I know exactly who you are, I know precisely what you need, and I honor that, fully, even when honoring it means we are not standing in the same room. That is, if you really think about it, a harder kind of love than the version we're usually sold. It requires more trust. more genuine security, a far deeper, more patient knowledge of another human being than most relationships ever get the chance to build. Philip and Elizabeth had 73 years to learn each other completely. And whatever they learned in that time, they honoured it faithfully, right up until the very end. And here's why all of this actually matters, beyond just being a moving piece of royal history. For years, the British tabloids got this story wrong. Badly. Repeatedly. And largely without consequence. Newspaper after newspaper ran stories implying that this separate living arrangement was proof of a marriage quietly failing. They speculated endlessly about estrangement, about decades of buried resentment, about a royal marriage that had survived only in name by the end. They built entire narratives on a foundation of willful misunderstanding, because a story about a broken marriage sells more papers than a story about a healthy one. Think about the business incentive at play here, because it explains almost everything. A headline that reads royal couple content with their unconventional but functional arrangement doesn't sell papers. It doesn't generate clicks. It doesn't get shared. But royal marriage in crisis does every single time, regardless of how thin the actual evidence behind it happens to be. So editors reached for the more dramatic interpretation again and again, not necessarily because they had any real evidence pointing toward estrangement, but because the more sensational version of the story was simply more profitable. This is worth remembering any time you read a royal headline that seems designed to shock rather than inform. The incentive structures behind that kind of journalism reward drama over accuracy, and Philip and Elizabeth's marriage is one of the clearest examples of just how much damage that incentive can do to the actual truth. And the damage from that is real. Every single person who read those headlines and believed them walked away with a diminished, distorted view of two people who, by almost every available account, deserved far better. Two people who had each given their lives, in very different but equally total ways, to service and to duty. Two people who built a partnership solid enough and deep enough to accommodate real individual needs without ever actually fracturing. There's also something worth saying about Philip himself here, because his story often gets flattened into a footnote in his wife's much larger narrative. He was a man who, by every account of people who served alongside him in the Royal Navy, possessed genuine talent and drive in a career he was forced to abandon entirely the moment Elizabeth became Queen. He gave up promotion, gave up a life at sea he'd genuinely loved, and stepped into a role that had never really been designed with any clear job description at all. Consort. A word that describes almost nothing about what the actual day-to-day experience of that life required. He had to invent the role as he went, decade after decade, absorbing criticism for stepping too far into public life and criticism for not stepping far enough, all while maintaining, at least publicly, an almost impossibly even temperament. Wood Farm, in that light, wasn't just a retirement home. It was close to the only genuinely self-determined chapter of his entire adult life. Here's what I keep coming back to, more than anything else in this entire story. After Philip died, Elizabeth flew to a modest Norfolk cottage and stayed there. She cooked in his kitchen. She slept in the rooms he had personally rearranged to suit himself. She looked, every day, at watercolor paintings he had made with his own hands and hung on the walls himself. She stayed there through at least the 6th of February, the anniversary of her accession, the single day that had defined the entire shape of their shared life together. She was 95 years old. A widow. The Queen of England. And she chose to spend her nights in a 5-bedroom farmhouse in Norfolk, because that was where he had been happiest, because being close to the place he loved was the closest she could still get to him. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the real truth of this marriage, I'm not sure anything ever could. There's something worth noting about grief itself here, something that applies well beyond palace walls. When people we love die, we often find ourselves drawn, almost involuntarily, back to the physical spaces that held them most completely. Not necessarily the places that were most historically significant, or most photographed, or most publicly associated with them, but the ordinary, unremarkable places where they simply existed as themselves. A kitchen. A reading chair by a window. A row of books arranged in a particular order that made sense only to them. Elizabeth returned to Wood Farm again and again across the final months and years of her own life, follows exactly that pattern, the pattern of grief seeking out the ordinary rather than the ceremonial. She had access to every palace, every stateroom, every grand residence available to a reigning monarch. And she chose, repeatedly, an unassuming farmhouse with an outdated kitchen and low timber beams, because that was where Philip had actually lived, rather than merely where he had been seen. Philip and Elizabeth didn't live apart because something between them had quietly broken. They lived apart, at least for those final years, because something between them was, in the truest sense, whole. Whole enough, strong enough, and secure enough to let each other be fully, freely, exactly who they actually were, without either of them ever needing to prove it to the other, or to anyone watching from the outside. 73 years. Separate bedrooms from the very beginning. Eventually, separate homes entirely. And, by nearly every measure that actually matters, one of the great, quietly enduring love stories of the 20th century. It's worth remembering, too, that this was a marriage that unfolded almost entirely in public, under a level of scrutiny that very few relationships in human history have ever had to withstand. Every anniversary marked by official portraits. Every argument, real or imagined, fodder for 100 different newspapers looking for a story. Every silence from the palace treated as confirmation of whatever theory happened to be circulating that particular month. And through all of that pressure, across 7 decades, the actual substance of their marriage, the quiet trust, the mutual respect, the willingness to give each other exactly the kind of space and freedom each of them needed, remained largely intact and, crucially, largely private. The tabloid saw the gaps, the separate residencies, the connecting doors, the miles of Norfolk countryside between one cottage and one castle, and filled those gaps with the most dramatic story available. What they missed, almost entirely, was the actual explanation sitting quietly behind all of it the whole time. Not distance. Understanding. So tell me honestly, in the comments below. Does this change the way you see their marriage? Did you believe the tabloid version of this story at the time? And do you think there's something in Philip and Elizabeth's example that the rest of us could genuinely learn from in our own relationships? I'd really like to know what you think, so drop your thoughts below, because I don't think this conversation is finished. And if this story moved you even half as much as it moved me putting it together, do me one more favor. Share it with someone. Because some stories deserve to be told properly, and this is one of them. If you want more of these, the real histories behind the headlines the tabloids got wrong, subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss the next one.